All right, everyone. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds. However, always great to see such a full room. The fire department does not like to see such a full room. So we have an overflow room downstairs. Please, if you're standing in the hallways, if you're sitting down, we'll ask you to move downstairs. It is a fire hazard to have the entrances blocked. So please, if you're standing on the sidelines or sitting, come downstairs. The experience is just as great. Please. Do we want to see TPF continue existing? Do we want the fire department to shut us down? Will you help keep this place fire hazard safe?
This is the largest audience we've had.
I think so.
I forgot.
All right, everybody. Welcome to our 5th and final session of a short course on Palestine. Music? Can we cut music? Music. I know. All right. Wonderful, wonderful. All good, all good. All right, we're back. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for really what has been an intense and deep study over the past 4, now 5 weeks. And today I'm sad to say that this is our final session. However, we know that our study doesn't stop here. In fact, this should be the foundation that we continue to build our study on Palestine and our study in the region on, correct? Excellent. And we especially know that our studies are even more pertinent now. This particular session, genocide in Gaza, is even more pertinent now because we see less than 20 days into the ceasefire, Israel has continually, flagrantly violated the ceasefire, continuously bombing Gaza, unabashedly, unashamed. And we know that it's our duty as people of conscience in the United States and around the world to continue to stand with the Palestinian people, to continue to demand an arms embargo, continue to demand AIPAC out of US politics and all of these things, which we'll get to at the end. But without further ado, I'd like to pass it over for the final time of this class to Professor Rashid Khalidi to lead us through the session.
Thank you, Sadie. Thank you. Thanks. I'm sort of sad this is our last session together.
Back next week.
I'll be on an airplane next Tuesday at this hour, I hope. But I wish I could be with you. So although I'm sorry I was unable to teach the course I was scheduled to teach at Columbia, that gave me the opportunity to teach this course and to teach you, many more people, a much more varied, diverse audience than I would otherwise have had. I don't want to say anything bad about Columbia students. I love them, but I have many more people that are listening to this than would have listened to my course. I want to say a couple of words about the charity to which all of the revenue from the books you've purchased, the textbooks you've purchased here, has gone. And to which all the revenue from your donations to the 501c3 ISNED, which is listed on the syllabus and on the People's Forum website. We've raised almost $80,000 for the main universities in Gaza, which have been throughout this genocide functioning. How, I cannot tell you. I cannot believe the bravery and the determination of the people who are doing this, both students and faculty and staff. All of the money is going to faculty and staff salaries and to paying the tuition of the students who are able to study. If you have it in your capacity, I hope you will donate more. I'd love to see us get even more than $80,000. That would really be great. I have a quick question. How many of you here have done some of the readings beyond perhaps the 100 Years' War? So a few of you. Okay, that's really good. Wow. That's better than a lot of Columbia classes I've taught, actually. That's great. I'm going to actually be referring to one of the readings assigned for today, an article I wrote called The Dahya Doctrine. I'll be talking about that later in this this evening's session. Today I want to talk about not so much the Gaza war itself, but the background and the implications of the Gaza war. I'm going to do that under 4 headings, as always. I'm going to talk about the lead up to this war and some of the background relating to Gaza itself. Secondly, I want to talk about how what has been done to Gaza is not new or unique or different. It is a continuation of the practice of the Israeli army, which itself is a continuation of the doctrine and the practice of colonial armies, specifically the British Army, which taught the people who founded the Israeli army everything they know. That's the second thing I want to talk about. The third thing I want to talk about is the impact of the Gaza war on public opinion in the world, in Europe, and in this country. And finally, I want to talk about some legal issues. One of the sad things that this war has done to us is it has forced many of us who are having to deal with former students and friends being caught up in the toils of the legal machinery to learn a lot more about the law than I ever intended to do. And I want to talk a little bit about a really important opinion, and there are a couple of really important opinions which I think we should pay attention to. In order to have an intelligent defense against the idiotic attacks that are directed against activists, against students, claiming discrimination, harassment, anti-Semitism, and so on. There's a wonderful court opinion I'm going to read parts of, which I think blows that nonsense completely out of the water. So I'm going to conclude with that, which I think is a good thing. Okay, I want to begin by saying a few words about Gaza's history, both its earlier history and its history leading up to this genocide. It turns out that Gaza is not just some fly-blown spot with refugees on the coast of the Mediterranean. Gaza is a very ancient oasis and port city. It was a prosperous center of trade for 5 or 6 millennia at least. That's what the historical record tells us. And it was always a strategic point on the coast road between North Africa and West Asia, between Egypt and Palestine. It was the gateway to the Middle East from Africa, the gateway to Africa from the Middle East. And it was on the caravan route between Arabia and Egypt, or Arabia and the Near East, or Arabia and the Mediterranean. So it was really, really actually quite an important trading center, literally for millennia, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And all of this is recorded in the archaeology of Gaza. Tragically, because it is so strategically important, it has been fought over by every imperial formation in recorded history. The pharaohs, the Hyksos, Alexander the Great, the Romans, the Crusaders, the Mamluks, Napoleon and the French in 1799 besieged Gaza. General Allenby in 1917 besieged Gaza. And it has been a center that has been fought over, whether in the 48 war, the 56 war, the 67 war, or since the Israeli occupation, ever since, right down to the present day. And that's the tragic history of Gaza as an important strategic spot. Now, in spite of the repeated devastation caused by all of these battles over literally millennia to control this strategic crossroads, Gaza contained remarkable archaeological sites. It contained some of the most ancient churches and mosques in Palestine. It contained artifacts going back to every single one of the eras that I've talked about, the Pharaonic era, the Roman era, and so on, and various Islamic periods. And many of these had already been discovered. And much of what was discovered has been destroyed in this genocide. Many of the museums, many of the archaeological sites have been very severely damaged. We will only know in time what, if anything, can be salvaged from those barbaric assaults on archaeological sites. The places damaged include some of the churches and mosques that were still standing, actually. Now, in fact, if you're interested in more, there's an article in a recent issue of the London Review of Books which reviews a reviews an exhibition that took place at the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris. And I think it's still on, actually, with artifacts that were taken out of Gaza and could not be taken back, and as a result were not destroyed. So by some miracle, they're still in one piece, and they're on display at the Institut du Monde Arabe, if any of you happen to be in Paris. Or if you can find an issue of the London Review of Books, you can read the article. And you can see just a little bit about how incredibly rich the archaeological past of Gaza is. So Gaza has had a troubled ancient history. It has had an even more troubled modern history. It was the front line between British and Ottoman forces for a very long period during World War I. It was the scene of 3 ferocious battles: the First Battle of Gaza, the Second Battle of Gaza, the Third Battle of Gaza, in 1917, which included artillery and aerial bombardments, which included intensive, fierce trench warfare, included the use of poison gas. Some of the first aerial photography in combat was taken by both Ottoman and German and Austrian and British pilots during the various campaigns in and around Gaza. As a result of these 3 horrific battles, I mean, it was like a World War I battlefield. It was like the Battle of the Somme. I mean, it completely flattened the area. The city was devastated. During the Mandate, in the period after World War I, rebuilding was very, very slow. And it had barely recovered its role as a trading center and as a crossroads when the 1948 war came. A barrier of the wall, of the military line between armistice between Egypt and Israel was created, and the city ceased to be a transit point. People couldn't cross in and out of it anymore. And what we call the Gaza Strip came into being as the area to which the Egyptian army retreated and into which people fled as they were driven from their homes in southern Palestine during the Nakba. That's what created the Gaza Strip. I've touched on some of this. I've also touched in previous lectures, which you can, by the way, if you missed any of them, you can catch them. I believe they're on YouTube. But just go to the site and it'll tell you how to get to the lecture 1, lecture 2, lecture 3, lecture 4. So I've already touched on some of the recent history. The Gaza Strip was subject to fierce attacks by Israel in 55 and 56 before the Sinai War, supposedly in reprisal for Fedayeen attacks. Israel's attacks killed hundreds of people. The Fedayeen attacks killed a few. And those proportions are consistent with Israeli practice. And I'm going to talk about why that's the case. I'm going to talk about why the casualty ratio in this war has been at least 35 or 40 to 1. For every one Israeli who's been killed, there have been 35 to 40 Palestinians killed. Most on both sides, most on the Palestinian side, obviously, civilians. More than half on the Israeli side, military and security personnel. But the ratio is what you have to keep in mind. 35 or 40 to 1. We don't know how many people were killed. There were 60,000, 70,000, 65, 68, 70, 80, we don't know. It will take God knows how long to uncover all the bodies buried under the rubble. The figure that's bandied about is at least 10,000 people missing. So at least 70,000 people. Now, another episode of horrific violence in Gaza took place after Israel occupied Gaza during the 1956 war. In reprisal for the resistance activity based in Gaza that had taken place before the war, Israeli soldiers massacred hundreds of unarmed male prisoners in 2 episodes in Rafah and in Khan Yunis after the war had ended, after Israel was in occupation. There was no combat going on. These people were rounded up and they were murdered. I heard of this a few years later from a relative of one of the victims who told me in detail how his cousins were taken off and then they found their bodies later on. This is well documented by the United Nations, actually. After the 1967 occupation, Gaza became the scene of the most intense resistance in the entire occupied territories. And that has really been the case ever since. Gaza has always been a locus of resistance to occupation, provoking ferocious campaign by the Israeli occupation forces. The person most identified with this campaign was the commander of the Southern Command of the Israeli army, Ariel Sharon, who at that time was a major general. Sharon already had a brutal record as the founder of something called Unit 101, which was created at the behest of the then Chief of Staff, Moshe Dayan, which carried out murderous retaliatory operations. Always they killed a dozen or 24 times as many people as they were retaliating for. Always. And I'm going to come back to why this was. Almost always civilians. In fact, invariably civilians in their great majority. Sharon succeeded through this and other means in finally breaking the resistance in the Gaza Strip, at least for a while, in the 1970s. He carried out vast clearance operations in which they drove huge, wide roads through the refugee camps to enable the passage of tanks and armored vehicles. They carried out assassinations, they shot prisoners, they used torture, administrative detention, and the tactics that had been taught to people like Sharon by British officers in the 1930s. None of this was entirely new. I've talked about Ord Wingate and how he trained Israeli militiamen from the Palmach and the Haganah, and this was the kind of training that Sharon had been subjected to. Gaza continued from this point on to be the center of Palestinian resistance. This is true of almost every political group, every resistance group that has risen in Palestine since 1948. The major leaders of Fatah all came from the Gaza Strip. Yasser Arafat came from the Gaza Strip. Abu Iyad came from the Gaza Strip. Abu Jihad came from the Gaza Strip. Some of them were refugees from elsewhere. Abu Iyad was from Jaffa originally, but they grew up in the Gaza Strip and later went on to universities and careers elsewhere. But this is where they got together. This is where the nucleus of Fatah developed. It later on was founded in Kuwait, but these are people who came to Kuwait from Gaza, or at least Gaza was where they were refugees for many, many years. The same thing is true of the PFLP, even though its founders were elsewhere. The most important center of the PFLP in the occupied territories in the 60s and the 70s was the Gaza Strip. And as you know, Gaza was the site of the founding of Hamas. So every major Palestinian political resistance group since 1948 has roots in the Gaza Strip. Together with a few other locales, like the refugee camps all over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip was recognized by Israel as especially dangerous to the Zionist project of taking control of the entirety of Palestine via colonization and slowly forcing the population out. Now, they did this in various ways. In 1948, through the Nakba. I mean, physically massacring enough people to scare the rest and force them to leave, or simply driving them out at the point of a bayonet, or with artillery fire, or whatever it may be. In 1967, they drove out 300,000 people by simply rounding them up, putting them on buses, taking them to the Jordan River. The refugee camps along the Jordan River on the West Bank were emptied that way. Various villages in the West Bank were emptied that way. Parts of Jerusalem were emptied that way. 300,000 people were just simply removed from the occupied territories. From Gaza, they did the same thing, forcing people into Egypt immediately after the 67 war. And that process has really continued ever since 1967, making life so difficult for people in, slow, grinding, mechanical, careful ways, such that sooner or later, one or two people in a family leave, and with the pressures continuing, often others will leave. It hasn't really measurably decreased the population of the occupied territories. There are still over almost 6 million people between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and occupied Arab East Jerusalem, but it has prevented that population from growing even more. This constant pressure, people not having their residence permits renewed, people not being allowed to get to work, and finally not having work and having to leave, that kind of thing. So I think all of this is a background that we should keep in mind to the siege of Gaza, which began in some respects with the Oslo Accords, which was the beginning of what Israel called separation. And what it began to do was to create checkpoints and began to create walls and began to create, in effect, little Bantustans within the occupied territories, such that instead of the Palestinians being in most of the occupied territories and there are a few Israeli settlements, as the situation was from 1967 till 1993, Israel controlled most of the occupied territories, and the Palestinians were restricted to a few limited areas. This was the intended effect by Israel of the Oslo Accords. I don't think the PLO realized what they were getting into. The siege intensified in the wake of the 2005 redeployment of Israeli forces to maintain the occupation from outside the Gaza Strip instead of from within the Gaza Strip. And the removal at the same time of several Israeli settlements that had been planted inside the Gaza Strip between 1967 and 2005. This siege, I think it's important to note, began before the 2006 elections, in which Hamas won a majority of seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council. So this was not a response to Hamas's takeover of the Gaza Strip, so-called, in 2007, nor to Hamas's victory in the 2006 elections, in which, by the way, they only won 43% of the vote. They won a majority of seats, as you can do in the British Parliament. You can have 38% of the vote and have a thundering majority because of the way in which constituencies are drawn. And that's what happened in the 2005 election. But even before that victory, even before the conflict with Fatah, which led to Hamas taking over the Gaza Strip in 2007, Israel had imposed a siege, a blockade, preventing more than a minimum amount of calories per person, preventing the entry of enormous range of equipment for medical and construction and other purposes, saying that it was dual-use equipment and that it could be used for military purposes as well as for incubators or oxygen machines or whatever, or the building of homes and so on. So this siege has been ongoing for over 20 years in the most intensive possible form. It has not been lifted ever over 20 years. You cannot get in, you cannot get out, you cannot import, you cannot export without going through a mechanism which is intended to stifle commerce, intended to stifle progress within the Gaza Strip. And that is a regime which this current so-called ceasefire, which, as Sadie said, is not being enforced as far as Israel is concerned by the United States or anybody else. This ceasefire, in fact, allows that siege to continue. So we've had 20 years of this. And in fact, it really goes back to 93, 94, 95, when they began to impose checkpoints and restrictions on movement. I remember when we were living in Jerusalem in the early 1990s, you could take a car from Jerusalem, drive to Gaza without anybody stopping you, pretty much, in the early 1990s, before this new regime of checkpoints and walls was established, and long before this siege of 2005. You could go anywhere. You could go from the West Bank to Haifa, you could go from the West Bank to the Golan Heights, you could go to Aqaba, you could go to anywhere in Palestine, anywhere inside Israel, and anywhere inside the Green Line, you could go. And that is what Oslo obstructed, and then the siege in 2005, as far as the Gaza Strip, made this infinitely more intense and more difficult. It intensified over time, and it was followed by a variety of military campaigns against Gaza. 2008, 2009, 2014, a terrible, terrible campaign in 2014. Operation Cast Lead. The Israelis have these extraordinary names for their attacks. Another one in 2021, and now the war that we've been witnessing for the past 2 years. I want to shift now. That's the background I wanted to give. That's the first part of what I wanted to talk about. I want to shift now and talk about how Israel has made explicit its doctrine of collective punishment. And it did so about the same time as it was leaving the Gaza Strip, in terms of moving its occupation to the outside rather than detaining it from within the Gaza Strip. And this was after the 2005 war that Israel waged with Lebanon. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I want to first talk about the genocide that we've been watching briefly. It's been live streamed before our eyes. It's shown Israeli spokespersons and politicians to be the lying liars we always knew they were, but we really can see it day in, day out. They say one thing and you can see something else is happening, if you have eyes to see. I could throw horrifying statistics at you about the cost of this genocide. It killed 100 people a day for 740 days. It killed 19,000 students, elementary school, high school, college students. Overall, over at least a quarter of a million people were killed and wounded. That's 1 in 8 of the Gaza population. More than half of those people were women and children, or old people. I could go on, and I'm not going to. Instead, I want to make an important point about what we've been seeing in Gaza for the past 2 years, and about how this relates to the practice of the Israeli military since its inception in 1948, and actually even before 1948. And this takes us to something that I touched on during my first lecture on September 30th, which you can go back and listen to if you weren't here. I talked in that first lecture about the way in which the British Army suppressed the 1936-39 revolt, using mainly intense violence directed mainly against civilians. This is important. The British obviously were chasing down the rebels, but most of what they were doing was attacking the civilian population, which they knew supported the rebels. As I argued, this was not a coincidence. The British used 100,000 British soldiers, the RAF, over 40,000 auxiliaries who were recruited from the Palmach and the Haganah, and became settlement police, auxiliary policemen, and so on and so forth. 40,000 trained, armed, and supplementing the 100,000 soldiers the British brought in. They killed, wounded, detained, or exiled between 17 and 19% of the adult male population of Palestine. Between 17 and 19% were killed, wounded, detained, or exiled. Many of those people killed were simply executed in the field or after kangaroo court trials before military tribunals. If any of that sounds familiar, it's because, as we're going to see, these are the doctrines that were imparted thereafter to the Israeli army, including things like destroying homes, destroying crops, destroying fruit trees, olive trees, orchards, and so on. Extensive use of detention without trial, extensive use of torture, extensive use of the murder of prisoners after capture, and much, much, much more. This is what the British did. This is how they mastered the revolt. None of this was an accident. None of this was a rogue officer doing something against orders. None of this was random. All of this violence against civilians was intentional, premeditated, and was based on the doctrine for counterinsurgency warfare that was taught to British officers at Sandhurst, at Woolwich, the 2 main military academies, and at the General Staff College. The textbook that was the basis of this counterinsurgency doctrine was written in 1896. It went through 3 different editions. It was called Small Wars, Their Principles and Practices. It was written by a man who eventually became a Major General, Sir Charles Colwell, and that book was in use in British military academies into the 1930s when another version of the same kind of doctrine was produced by another British military officer. That book is still in print. You can find it online. Small Wars. You can buy it. Published by the University of Kansas Press. It has been in use until recently, I think, possibly still in use in the U.S. Army's Staff and Command College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And what does Colwell do in this book? He basically says, look, I'm going to draw on the lessons of every major colonial war, fought by Britain in Africa, fought by Britain in India, fought by Britain in other parts of the world, fought by the French in Algeria, fought by the Dutch in Indonesia. He draws on a vast array of examples from almost every single colonial war you can think of, and certainly every British colonial war, going back more than a century, written in almost a century, written in 1896. In fact, he talks about the Peninsula campaigns against Napoleon's troops, so going back almost entirely, almost an entire century. And I'm going to read you some quotes from Colwell. He writes, I quote, "In the suppression of rebellion," I can't imitate the accent, I couldn't possibly, British Major General, imagine. "In the suppression of a rebellion, the refractory subjects of a ruling power must all be chastised and subdued. Note his use of the word all. He adds, in a war against an uncivilized nation, operations are sometimes limited to committing havoc, which the laws of regular warfare do not sanction. Colwell goes on to affirm that what he calls a moral effect on the opponent is supremely important. You have to intimidate them. You have to have an impact on them. He adds that uncivilized races attribute leniency to timidity. Savages and fanatics must be thoroughly brought to book and cowed, or they will rise again. He sees a clear racial hierarchy here. The enemy must be made to feel a moral inferiority throughout. The lower races are impressionable. They are greatly influenced by a resolute bearing and a determined course of action. Every single British officer who graduated from a military academy for generations was taught this stuff, okay? Every staff officer, in other words, everyone who rose higher than lieutenant or captain and became a staff officer and later on a colonel or a general, every single one of them was taught with this book. This is the doctrine of British counterinsurgency. This is what was being used in Palestine. When they blew up houses over their inhabitants, or they murdered people in a village from which they thought an attack had come, they were carrying out not just orders from their commanders, they were doing what they had been trained and taught to do. Now, I've spoken in this class of some of my recent research on Britain, Ireland, and Palestine, and this is one of the things that I learned. I found the degree, not only to which what the British themselves had been doing in Ireland. In Ireland, for example, one of the things that Colwell says is you must attack their crops. You must attack the economic basis of these villages. It's not enough to attack the civilians. You have to destroy the basis of their livelihood. And he particularly focused, because the campaigns that he was most familiar with were in places like Sudan and the Northwest Frontier Province, of what was then called the Northwest Frontier Province of India, in which people were herders. So he said, attack their herds. You have to kill their animals. And he talks about this, actually, in specific cases. He talks about how this general did it right, and this fellow didn't do it quite so well. And so when they went into Ireland, what did they do? Ireland has an economy which is largely agricultural, or had an economy that was largely agricultural. It's still partially the case. Irish butter, for example. Come on, Kerrygold butter. None of you know what I'm talking about. I guess nobody eats butter anymore. It's all olive oil, eh? Okay, anyway. It had an economy which was very largely agriculturally based. And there were agricultural cooperatives to bring in all of the cream and turn it into butter. Almost every Irish village had a creamery, and it was a major economic institution in the village. It involved a cooperative which had gathered capital in order to build the creamery. It belonged to the village. It was collective property in most cases. It wasn't private. And it was the center of at least that part of the agricultural economy. In every village that the British attacked, they destroyed the creamery. This was not a coincidence. They read Colwell and said, well, what do we have here? We don't have herds. And sometimes they did kill the cattle, but more often they were, by this time the British had become sentimental about animals. We're talking about 1920s. But they weren't sentimental about economic infrastructure. And so they destroyed the creameries in village after, and it was, you read the news reports and you're saying, this is not a coincidence. They're doing it again and again and again and again. And then you go back and read Colwell. They were taught to do this. And in Palestine, of course, they had to find the equivalent, so olive trees, whatever it was. And they did that. And the other thing that I found all of this out in this work that I'm now doing, trying to do. But one of the other things that I found out was the degree to which the officers who were became the first generals in the Israeli army drew on these British doctrines and practices, which they were trained in by British officers like Ord Wingate. I've already gone into this a couple of times. I don't want to repeat it again. You can go back and listen to the first lecture if you're interested. What is important to understand is that these doctrines and these practices, faithfully implemented by generals like Moshe Dayan and Yigal Allon, who themselves were personally trained by Wingate. Alon has a book, The History of the Israeli Army, in which he says, I was trained by Wingate. I owe everything I ever did to Wingate. He's the man who drove the population of Lid and Ramli out at gunpoint. The entire population of both cities were by Yigal Alon himself. He learned these things from Wingate himself, and Wingate had studied at Woolwich, one of these two military academies. So, what I learned, in other words, is that these doctrines, faithfully implemented by these generals, who were the first commanders of the Israeli army, and afterwards, have since been further codified by their successors. In other words, this is not just what the Israeli army was taught to do, or the people who became the leaders of the Israeli army were taught to do in the 1930s and implemented in the Nakba. This has become doctrine, but it has been developed. This development of Israeli military strategy was formally revealed by Israeli military officers after this attack on Lebanon in 2006. And it was a strategy which came to be called the Dahiya doctrine. Now, what's a Dahiya? Dahiya is a suburb. Any suburb of any city is the Dahiya, okay, like the banlieue, the suburbs. It has come to be the name of a specific southern suburb of Beirut, which is an area which was a center for Hezbollah. And it was absolutely flattened by Israel in 2006 during their war with Lebanon. And the man who commanded the northern command of the Israeli army, a man named Major General Gadi Eisenkot, was later chief of staff of the Israeli army, and then became a minister in the current government. He left a few months ago, but he was minister from very soon after the 7th of October, 2023, until late in 2024, or early 2025, when he left the government. So this is a guy who's been involved in doing stuff, whether in Lebanon or since. And as I say, he was a minister for more than a year after October 7th. After forces under his command had flattened the Dahi, they have done it again, by the way. It's been destroyed yet again. This was done during the war on Lebanon last year. After his forces had done this in 2006, mainly using American 2,000-pound bombs, Eisenkot explicitly laid out what the Dahiya doctrine entailed. He said this in an interview to Yediot Ahronot, one of the major, probably the most important Israeli paper. And you can read it on their English language website, which is called Ynet. So he stated, and I'm now quoting Eisenkot, what happened in the Dahiya quarter of Beirut in 2006, i.e. flattened, destroyed, will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. We will apply disproportionate force. Note that term. We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction there. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages. They are military bases. This is not a recommendation. This is a plan, and it has been approved. This is all in the article, The Dahiya Doctrine, which is in your syllabus. I mean, the whole article is from the Journal of Palestine Studies. Where was I? Oh, I'm missing a page here. Oh, bingo. So what Eisenkot was doing, or saying rather, was that Israeli military strategy explicitly intended to violate international humanitarian law. Now, if you know anything about international humanitarian law, which I've been obliged to do, its basic principles for the use of force demand that it be proportional and discriminate. The use of force must be proportional and it must be discriminate if it is not to be in violation of international humanitarian law. There's no way around it. I mean, that's what international humanitarian law says. Yes, you may use violence. Sometimes civilians will be killed. But that violence in which civilians are involved must be proportional and discriminate. Otherwise, it's a violation of the rules of law and possibly a war crime. So what Eisenkot's statement amounts to is an open admission by a senior Israeli officer, later chief of staff, most recently a minister, that Israel had already systematically violated international humanitarian law by destroying the Dahi, and intended to continue to do so as a matter of policy. This is a recommendation. This is not a recommendation. It is a plan, and it has already been adopted. So all the blather that you may hear from Admiral Kirby, who, by the way, Admiral Kirby, former spokesman for the National Security Council, you heard him throughout the first year of the war under President Biden pronouncing from the podium, a much nicer podium than I like this podium, but a much more solid podium in the White House, about how Israel's army was the most moral army in the world, and how Israel never did, wouldn't violate international humanitarian law. He said it again and again and again. This man has just been appointed to the head of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. If any of you are alumni, write them and tell them what a disgrace this is. Pardon me?
My donations are done.
No, but write them and tell them that. Tell them that. They deserve to be punished. Imagine this man, Admiral Kirby. Anyway, so what Eisenkot was admitting is that Israel intended to, as a matter of policy, violate international humanitarian law. At the same time, they continue to talk about the most moral army in the world, and how about they never violate international humanitarian law. All of this, of course, is just a smokescreen for these intentional violations of these laws that is aided and abetted by Western governments, which have never called out Israel for its intentional, premeditated targeting of civilians. That is what this is. That is what they have always done. That's what they've actually now admitted to doing. I mean, we can dig into history and see that that is what they did, but they never admitted it. Here, we have Eisenkot actually saying, this is a plan and it's been approved. Yo, we're going to do it. Like it, don't like it, we're doing it. And they've continued, of course, to do it. And all of this is aided and abetted by the mainstream media in their role of corrupt, complicit stenographers for power. They've been gaslighting us for 2 years, telling us that we're not seeing what we actually are seeing before our very eyes. But stuff like this, I think, should disabuse anybody who's willing to listen of those illusions. So that's the second section that I wanted to talk about. The third section that I want to talk about has to do with the impact of the Gaza genocide on public opinion globally. I could bore you stiff with statistics. A YouGov poll said 20% of Europeans in 6 countries, a maximum of 20% of Europeans in 6 countries support Israel. Only 20% support United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Denmark. Never in history has Israel enjoyed only 20% support in those major European countries. I could give you American polls by the dozen, which show the same kinds of things. I'm not going to do that. I don't think this course would be reaching hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people, but for the dramatic shift in public opinion on Palestine and Israel. I don't think that books on Palestinian poetry or essays on Palestine or monographs on Palestine would be selling in the thousands every week. Some of these books are selling in the thousands every week. Amal Akkad's book, One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This. It's selling enormous numbers every week. It's been out now for months and months and months. That wouldn't have happened unless there had been a massive shift in public opinion. Nobody published books on Palestine 20 years ago. It wasn't that they weren't selling in the thousands. It's that they didn't exist. Were there books on Palestinian poetry? There were 3 in 40 years. Salma Khadra Jayusi's, there were 3. Maybe 2, maybe 3. Okay? In 30 years. Were there translations? A few. A few translations of Ghassan Kanafani, a few translations of Mahmoud Darwish, and that was it. Today you have every Palestinian poet who's ever opened their mouth has been published in English and is selling. Not just martyrs like Rifat Ali, every single one. And they're getting prizes. They're getting Pulitzer Prizes. They're being recognized by their peers. Theater, essays by the SCAD are being published, which means that they're making money because the publishing industry doesn't publish because it loves good literature. It loves good profits. And it is obviously making profits on these books. It's selling books on Israel as well, and probably making profits on those. But for the first time in history, these books are selling, and this is because there has been an enormous, enormous shift in public opinion. I mean, there are, I'm sure, other more sophisticated metrics for this besides public opinion polling and book sales. Things to do with, for example, social media. And I'm not going to try and throw any of those kinds of statistics at you. But the polls, I think, speak for themselves, the public opinion polling. Israel is at the lowest level of support ever in history in the United States and Europe. The Zionist project has been popular and widely supported across almost all political areas of politics in almost every Western country. The white settler colonies, Canada, Australia, major Western European countries, the United States, ever since 1917. There's not been a period in which there was not massive majority support for the Zionist project and later for Israel. Never, never, never in history. That's no longer the case. It's no longer the case in this country. It's no longer the case in most of the world. That goes without saying. But even in Western Europe, Canada, Australia, and so forth, and this country, this is an incredible, dramatic change. And the understanding and recognition of the Palestinian narrative and support for Palestinian liberation is higher than it's ever been before. This is not sophisticated stuff. These are just opinion polls. This doesn't mean people understand and they know and they have fully incorporated a Palestinian narrative, or they fully understand how meretricious and false all of the fables and fantasies and lies that have been taught as the Zionist narrative are. It doesn't mean people really, really know. It's hopefully many, many sessions like this and many, many books that people will eventually read or absorb and be able to have a fuller understanding of these things. But the shift has already started. It started in particular with young people. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I think that something historical seems to have happened here. I think that historians will pore over the reasons for this for a very long time, even if it's reversed. It could be reversed. It doesn't look like it's going to be. I personally think that what a younger generation has seen cannot be unseen. And it wasn't just somebody told them something, or somebody read a slogan to them, or somebody said river to the sea. It's that they literally watched on their screens day after day in absolute horror people that they came to trust living in Gaza showing what actually was happening day after day until the Israelis killed them, which of course they systematically did. 240 people were killed, journalists, for reporting. Western journalists are still not allowed, outside journalists are still not allowed into the Gaza Strip by Israel. The idea of preventing the horrors that they're perpetrating from being known is something that they figured out a while ago. In spite of that, these very brave, mainly very young people, have shown people things that they will never, as I've said, unsee. And so I'm not sure that this can be reversed. But we'll see about that. Much depends on how events play out in the coming years and coming months, and how advocates for Palestine and the Palestinians themselves act, whether this can be turned into political change. Change in opinion comes and goes, but whether that can be turned into political change is another question. I want to, however, point out one clear conclusion that can be drawn from this enormous, rapid shift in public opinion. This is that it was most pronounced among the young, and that it spread from them to the rest of societies around the world. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard about young people arguing with and convincing their parents and grandparents. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard from students and from people I know. And that was true in the United States. It was true in the rest of the West. I think it was true all over the world. But it's especially important in this country and in Western countries because these are the essential metropole for the Zionist project and for Israel. I think young people, I think that young people ignited this shift by their activism on campus and in the streets. They've sustained it in spite of intense repression. Many of them are still suffering from that, and many of the people who attended these lectures have come up to me and said, I'm still suspended from Columbia, or I'm still suffering whatever penalty from this or that other university. So they sustained it in spite of this repression. And the polls show that the lower down you go on the age scale, the more intense the shift has been. And this is not just true of people who identify as progressive or as Democrats or as independents. This is true of Republicans. The younger you go on the age scale, the more critical they are of Israel. Even Republicans, even people who are identify with a political party that's completely supportive of Israel. And these people are certainly more critical of Israel. In many cases, they've become more sympathetic to the Palestinians. Obviously, everybody and his brother and sister knows that this is linked to younger people's reliance on social media, to independent media, to alternative media, and their complete ignorance of and disdain for the toxic mainstream media. I'm going to tell you two quick stories. A friend of mine said that he was talking to his 14-year-old daughter, and he mentioned to her CNN. And she said to him, "What is a CNN?" "No idea. Never heard of CNN." "That's a healthy thing. That is excellent. God bless her. That 14-year-old has been saved." And I've had experiences like that myself. I used to, 30 years ago, when I used to teach, and I'd see something in the New York Times, and I'd mention it in class. And in a room almost as big as this, maybe 10, 20% of the students would nod their heads because they had read the article that same morning. In the recent decade or more, I would mention something in the mainstream media. Nobody in class had any idea what I was talking about. Nobody had it. They didn't read the New York Times. Heaven forbid. I was teaching a course on my course on modern Middle East history, and last semester I mentioned an important event in modern Iranian history where the British government forced the Iranian government to give a concession to a British citizen by the name of Baron de Ruyter. And I said, Baron de Ruyter, the man who founded the Reuters news agency. And I looked around the room, and nobody knew what I was talking about. What's Reuters? Literally not one of 250 students had any idea what Reuters is. Now, again, I think that's entirely healthy. I'm very happy about that. I want them to learn about the concession in the 19th century in Iran. I don't give a damn if they don't know what Reuters is. Now, in light of this shift among, when I say young people, almost anybody under 50 this applies to. In light of this shift among a younger demographic, let's put it that way, not young people, a younger demographic. Good luck to the billionaires of enormous conglomerates like Skydance, Paramount, CBS, in trying to change this narrative under the new Hasbara specialist who's been appointed the head of CBS News. They're not going to reach those people. Nobody watches CBS who's under, I don't know what age. The only other thing I want to say about these enormous shifts in public opinion is that if they are sustained, and if they can be the basis for political change, this would pose a critical challenge to the very existence of the settler-colonial model that the Zionist project adopted early in the history of modern political Zionism. I'm going to repeat that. If these shifts are sustained, they may not be, but if they are, and if, much more difficult, they can be the basis for political change, this would pose a critical challenge to the very existence of the settler-colonial model that the Zionist project adopted early in the history of modern political Zionism by its alliance in the first instance with Britain and the Balfour Declaration. Without support from the Western metropole, the United States, Western Europe, white settler colonies, this project is currently, as it's currently constituted, has no future. Without that support, it has no future. Every combat warplane, every combat helicopter that Israel uses is manufactured in the United States. You cut off the weapons, the Israeli military doesn't have spare parts, cannot operate. Every single Merkava tank, every Namir armored personnel carrier uses a German engine. No German engines, they don't move. Okay? So everything they fly in combat and everything they use on the ground depends on arms supplies from Western Europe and the United States. And those are just two examples. There are many, many others. Most of the shells, artillery shells, most of the tank shells are manufactured either in the United States or in Western Europe. I could go on and on and on and on. Now, elites in the West still support Israel and the Zionist project. If that doesn't change, that project can go on, obviously with more and more friction with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is not going to put up with this. But as long as the Western metropole continues to support it, in spite of the greater friction that may ensue, the project could go on. But if public opinion can be transformed into political pressure, that could change in the West. That's a huge challenge. It's a huge opportunity for the generation that's driving these shifts. And by generation, I don't mean Generation Z or B or F or A. I mean, everybody under a certain age, 50, 45, whatever. It's a huge challenge for today and especially for the immediate future. Political change takes time. It requires much work and much organization. It's not something that you can be impatient about. I know many people were deeply frustrating. They found it heartrending to watch a live stream genocide and to see that all of the efforts to oppose this were not able to stop it. I know how frustrating that can be. People who went through the Vietnam War, like me, people who went through the war in Iraq, like maybe some of you, no, it takes a very long time to stop an imperial foreign adventure. It takes a very long time, and it's very hard. And this is a deeply rooted project with integral links since Balfour to major imperial projects in the Middle East. Zionism hitched onto an existing project. It was a hitchhiker on what Britain already was going to do. If Zionism hadn't come along, they would have done it anyway. They were going to occupy Palestine whether they did it through a settler colony or not. As I told you in the first lecture, they wanted it for reasons that had nothing to do with Jews, Zionism, anti-Semitism, Chaim Weizmann, anything of that sort. It was an imperial project, and Zionism attached itself to it. And today, what's happening in the Middle East is an imperial project to which Israel is integrally linked. And so you're not simply opposing a settler-colonial project. You're opposing the strategic interests of the metropole that support that project. And that's always been the case since the very beginning, and it's true to this day. Challenging these realities is going to take a lot of hard work over time, but I think there are opportunities today that no one could have seen coming 5 or 10 years ago. Anybody who told you 10 years ago that they thought majority opinion in the United States would oppose selling weapons to Israel, and that 27 Democratic senators would vote against arms to Israel during a war, you would tell them you were absolutely stark raving mad. What the hell are you talking about? That's nonsense. That couldn't possibly happen. It happened. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean anything has fundamentally changed yet, but I think it's a harbinger of opportunities that I think no one, as I say, could have seen coming 5 or 10 years ago. Okay. That was section 3. And I'm gonna finish a little earlier than usual today so that we have more time for questions. And then my colleagues and friends and comrades here in People's Forum want to say a few words about other projects related to Palestine after I finish. So I'm going to leave a little time for that. I want to conclude with what I think is some good news. There have been a number of court decisions recently on the tactics that supporters of genocide have used to try to reverse the activism that brought about this massive, rapid world historical shift in public opinion. In other words, seeing what has happened in encampments and on campuses and in the streets and in public opinion and in publishing and social media and so on. People who want to maintain the status quo in Palestine have resorted to a bunch of tactics. Calling opposition to Israel's policies anti-Semitic, for example, using Title VI of the Education Act to force universities to carry out kangaroo court disciplinary proceedings against students, and so on and so forth. And these tactics have been successful. And then, after the election of the Trump administration, they were adopted by the Trump administration as a means of forcing universities to do things that had nothing to do with campus protest or anti-Semitism or Israel or Palestine, but rather had to do with their larger agenda. So what I want to do here, in conclusion, is to read you selections from an opinion that was issued by the first Circuit's First Circuit Court of Appeals, which is based in Boston and covers the New England area, a week ago, on the 21st of October. And it was a decision, an opinion on an appeal of a case brought by 2 MIT students and a group called Stand With Us Center for Legal Justice in California, which is a front for various pro-Israel groups, and has carried out lawfare against advocates for Palestinian justice. So these students and this group, Stand With Us Center for Legal Justice, brought a suit against MIT. And the students and the center, this so-called center, were the plaintiffs in this suit. The suit was dismissed by a district judge, and they appealed, the students and the center, to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. And these are excerpts from the First Circuit's opinion, which is 54 pages, and I had it added to your syllabus today. So if you really want to get into this, you can do it. It's really worth reading every page. This opinion blows away all the flimsy, lying, meretricious arguments made by students supporting Israel and by university administrators, including the Columbia administration, that went along with these arguments and shut down campuses and punished pro-Palestine activists. So I'm reading now. Everything I'm going to read from now on is directly taken from the opinion of the First Circuit. These are not my words, these are their words. And I'm going to start with their arguments which relate to the First Amendment. And what they say is the following. And these are selections. This is a 54-page document. I'm reading you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs. The court said, and in the context of their opinion, they quote most frequently Supreme Court opinions. So whenever there's a quotation, it's usually from a Supreme Court opinion. So they're relying on what the Supreme Court has previously said about some of these issues. So the First Circuit said, in its opinion, most of the conduct about which plaintiffs complain, the students and Stand With Us, is speech protected by the First Amendment. It's very important. What students were doing is protected by the First Amendment. And we do not construe Title VI as requiring a university to quash protected speech. That was what they were maintaining. Title VI means you have to shut this down. First Amendment be damned. They went on to say, speech made in public that is related to matters of public concern has been given, and here they're quoting the Supreme Court, special protection under the First Amendment and thus cannot be restricted simply because it is upsetting or arouses contempt. We have gotten complaint after complaint of, I felt hurt by seeing a Palestinian flag, or somebody wore a keffiyeh and I felt intimidated. Again, speech made in public that is related to matters of public concern has been given, quote, Supreme Court now says, special protection under the First Amendment and thus cannot be restricted simply because it is upsetting or arouses contempt. They went on, again quoting the Supreme Court, and in public debate, citizens must tolerate insulting and even outrageous speech in order to provide adequate breathing space to the freedoms protected by the First Amendment, and the public expression of ideas, again, quoting the Supreme Court here, may not be prohibited merely because the ideas are themselves offensive to some of their hearers. That's the first section. They blew away the whole basis of everything that Columbia and a bunch of cowardly, craven, spineless universities have done on campuses across this country. Second section from that part of the opinion, again, about the First Amendment. Requiring MIT to restrict students' expression merely because those students opposed Israel and favored the Palestinian cause would infringe upon MIT's freedom to encourage rather than suppress a vigorous exchange of ideas. It is a bedrock first principle, and here they're quoting the Supreme Court again, that speech may not be banned on the ground that it expresses ideas that offend. That was the Supreme Court. They go on, nor can the reactions of an offended audience serve as grounds for the government to suppress such speech. In sum, the First Amendment erects safeguards that limit the ability of the government or private plaintiffs to punish MIT for not restricting more severely the student protesters' protected speech. This opinion blows away everything the Trump administration has said about anti-Semitism on campus. That universities do not have the responsibility to shut down people who say things that some people don't like, which is essentially what the Trump administration was saying. And essentially what every cowardly, craven university bowed down and banged its head on the ground and said, yes, sir, Mr. Trump, sir, from the moment, even sometimes before they were asked to do anything. In the case of Columbia, preemptive capitulation. And in the case of many other universities, the same thing. Okay, that's the part of the opinion, and there are many other parts to the opinion that relate to the First Amendment, and they're all equally brilliant. These people did their homework. I mean, I'm sure it was a bunch of legal interns. I'm not sure the members of the First Circuit were themselves digging through, Hannah Arendt and so on. But anyway, the second part is even better in some ways, because it has to do with arguments, some of the most specious and ludicrous, imbecilic arguments ever made. That any critique of Zionism is anti-Semitism, or many critiques of Israel are anti-Semitic. So I'm going to read you now several paragraphs, again from the opinion of the First Circuit, and where they quote the Supreme Court. I'll mention that they're quoting the Supreme Court. This is now the First Circuit. None of this is my language. This is their language. Plaintiffs, in other words, the two students and Stand With Us Center, plaintiffs are entitled to their own interpretive lens, equating anti-Zionism, as they define it, and anti-Semitism. So they're entitled to their own interpretive lens, to make their own ludicrous claims, in other words. But it is another matter altogether to insist that others must be bound by plaintiffs' views. Your biased interpretation of this cannot be imposed on other people, they go on. Nor can the possibility that anti-Semitism motivates one speaker's anti-Israel speech justify assuming that all criticism of Israel or advocacy for Palestinian sovereignty is motivated by anti-Semitism. We therefore reject plaintiffs' claimed right to stifle anti-Zionist speech by labeling it inherently anti-Semitic. The First Circuit. That's the first part. There's three others. Plaintiffs allege no facts plausibly establishing that the protesters, as a group, opposed Israeli actions in Gaza or supported the Palestinian cause because of anti-Semitic animus. They allege no facts that establish that that was what drove people who opposed genocide. Nor do plaintiffs allege facts plausibly showing that the protesters as a group shared plaintiffs' view that anti-Zionism was inherently anti-Semitic. We also reject plaintiffs' implicit contention that the choice to criticize Israel's actions in Gaza, rather than, for example, choosing to criticize some other alleged atrocity elsewhere in the world, necessarily manifests anti-Semitism. This is this idiotic aboutism. Why don't you complain about the Sudan? Why don't you complain about the Rohingya? And they have a whole paragraph, which I didn't bore you with, in which they say that is incredibly stupid. I mean, people can choose what they want to protest about. Who are you to say, if you don't protest about this, you can't... And they actually go into it. I should have read more of this. But anyway, I just chose a little bit. They went on to say, this is one of my favorite parts. Plaintiffs say that we should construe chants of, quote, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and, quote, intifada revolution, as calls to wipe out the Jewish people as such. But neither slogan says as much on its face, nor do plaintiffs allege facts suggesting that either chant was commonly so construed by the protesters. So plaintiffs must again rely on a theory that they can dictate the interpretation of the protesters' speech in order to suppress it. I mean, that is absolutely brilliant reasoning. I'm going to read that again. Plaintiffs say that we should construe chants of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and intifada revolution as calls to wipe out the Jewish people as such. But neither slogan says as much on its face, nor do plaintiffs allege facts suggesting that either chant was commonly so construed by the protesters. So protesters must again rely on a theory that they can dictate the interpretation of the protesters' speech in order to suppress it. I'm coming to the last one. Bear with me. This is in their conclusion. There's much more in the conclusion. You really should read the whole opinion. But anyway. Our Constitution bars the government from forcing a private university to prohibit students from voicing vehement support for or opposition to the policies of and conduct of the United States and its allies. That should be self-evident. For these reasons, we decline plaintiff's invitation to hold that the protesters' speech constituted anti-Semitic harassment actionable under Title VI merely because it was stridently pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionist. So, that's the First Circuit. We should send them roses or something. This is there's an equally brilliant opinion on the AAUP suit, which I won't talk about because it's as complicated as this one. The conclusion that I want you to draw from this is not that we have a great judicial system or anything like that, though the First Circuit has some really great judges or some wonderful legal interns who work for them. It is rather that the counteroffensive that has been launched and which seems so overwhelmingly powerful when you see what the Trump administration is forcing universities to do, when you see the fifth column within universities conspiring with the Trump administration to capitulate in advance. We had that at Columbia. We had a belief among the people who own the university, among people on the board of trustees, that Columbia was inherently anti-Semitic because there were people, mainly students but also faculty, who were critical of Israel. And they believed this for years and years and years and years and years. And they couldn't have been happier when the Trump administration adopted the views of the minority of students who felt that they were being harassed and that this was discriminatory and this was anti-Semitic and so on and so forth. That was a fifth column within the university. And you have the same kind of thing at Harvard and many other major American universities. The breadth and the depth of this counteroffensive, of this repression, may make people discouraged. It shouldn't. There is absolutely no basis in the Constitution, in law, in logic. I mean, the stuff I read you just makes sense. And what these people are saying is nonsense. And so I think it's really important we stand our ground. It's important that we say, no, this is not anti-Semitic. The United States is doing things with Israel that are violations of US law, that are violations of international humanitarian law, and that are morally reprehensible. And we have a responsibility and a right as American citizens to give our opinions on this. Otherwise, we're in a dictatorship. And we're not yet there. And we want to stop things from going in that direction. So I think that these kinds of opinions really should give us heart. There are many other things that should give us heart. I mean, the fact that a majority of public opinion is with us. The fact that Zohran Mamdani is about to be, inshallah, elected mayor in a city where the Biltmore Declaration was drafted, in a city which has given probably more money per capita to Israel than any other city on earth. The fact that this man is going to win a huge share of the Jewish vote in New York City is testament to the fact that people are changing. And those are the things that we should take heart from, this opinion and so on. So, I mean, I'm very heartened myself by the enormous number of people who have wanted to take this course, and many of whom actually did take the course. A lot of people signed up and didn't or couldn't. But it'll be online. We're going to hear now about other initiatives that the People's Forum is taking around Palestine. I'm going to step off the podium in a minute. I want to conclude by saying what somebody said to me last night. I delivered a lecture last night, and somebody came up to me and said, you know, it's really important and it's really good that you gave a historical basis for people's understanding of why they feel the way they do. It's really important that you're not just, I mean, I was indulging in a little bit of rhetoric from time to time in the talks that I gave you over these 5 days. But most of what I was trying to do was to give you a basis for understanding why we are where we are, why things are the way they are, conceivably how they could be changed. I'm not predicting anything. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. But these are the tools that I think you need if you really want to have an understanding of how to operate personally, in terms of activism, in terms of politics, and to understand what we're seeing. And we're now able to see it more clearly than we ever could when our only lens was the mainstream media, which is so fundamentally corrupt and biased that there's absolutely no use for it. a bunch of people, including myself, have just signed a petition saying that until the New York Times meets 3 conditions, we will not have anything to do with the New York Times. And this has been my bugaboo since I was a little kid. I grew up, part of my youth was in the city, part of my youth was listening to my father talk about the Security Council, what was happening, but unfortunately part of my youth was reading the New York Times. And that was a painful experience for many, many years. I still, for my sins, I still do it. And I know the gap. I've lived in Beirut during war. I've lived in Palestine for brief times. I've lived in other parts of the Arab world. I know something. I've read the history, I've taught the history, I've studied the history, I've researched the history, and I know that what they tell us is barefaced lies, most of the time. Occasionally they have good stuff. But they and the rest of the mainstream media are gaslighting us, are lying to us, are basically feeding us a propaganda line that is almost identical to the propaganda line produced by the Israeli government. And the fact that people have liberated themselves from that, and the fact that people are seeing the reality through independent media, through alternative media, through social media, whatever means that they're using, is great. But that doesn't teach you the background. That doesn't teach you the history. That doesn't teach you the why of what we're seeing. If you don't know Colwell's book, if you don't know what Wingate taught Diane and what Sharon learned and what they have been doing all along, whether it was the Brits or whether it was the Israeli military, you don't understand what just happened in Gaza. This was not just a reaction to October 7th. It was partly a reaction to October 7th, obviously, to the horrors that were perpetrated inside Israeli communities. But you have to understand that. You have to understand that the violence of an oppressor invariably produces violence of the oppressed. I mean, Fanon taught us that. Many other theorists have taught us that. This is not me teaching you that. You know that. But what is really going on is not just violence, counter-violence. It's not just the violence of the oppressed and the weak against the violence of the strong and the oppressors. It is also a systematic intention to destroy civilian life as a means of quelching opposition. That is what colonial warfare is all about. And that is what Israel has been engaged in since 1948. It's mainly directed at civilian populations. That's always been their practice, and that's what Caldwell was saying. I mean, we have to know these things. We have to understand these things. Well, every time they say most moral army in the world and we obey international humanitarian law, you have to know they're lying through their teeth, whether they realize it or not, whether they know it or not. We have to know those things. So today I gave you a few things. In earlier lectures, I tried to give you a few other things. If you really want to go deeper, you don't have to. But if you really want to go deeper, read the readings that I linked to each week for assigned readings. And if you want to go even deeper, there's more. There are books. Many of those books are not. All of the readings that are short readings you can get online through People's Forum. The books I assigned you can buy here. The others, just go out and buy them. They're wonderful, wonderful, wonderful books. Seth Anziska's book on how the United States has basically tailored the so-called peace process to the minimum that Israel is allowing the Palestinians. Other wonderful, wonderful books on this list. If you have the time and the energy, buy them, read them. And you will be the better for it. You'll be able to talk to relatives who don't understand. You'll be able to talk to colleagues who don't understand, to members of your peer group who don't understand. You'll have the factual basis, you'll have the historical basis to buttress your beliefs and your political positions with really well-argued understanding of reality. And what I've been trying to teach you is the reality. The fiction that they peddle you in the movies and in the mainstream media is our problem. But fortunately, I think things are changing for the better. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Khalidi. Bless you all. Thank you all. I'll be over here. Oh yeah, we do Q&A first. I'm sorry, you're here for that. Yeah, sorry. Yes, we have a little time.
Good amount of time.
Yeah.
Do maybe
Do it 20 minutes. Yeah, 20, 25 minutes.
All right. So actually, let's all lead, and then we have mic runners.
Yes, I'll pick the people. You don't need to do the work. Maybe this gentleman over here. The dude with the voting thing on his. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Khalidi. Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone. I was just listening to his most recent, video, and he was talking that what he thinks is basically beyond the yellow line, where the Israelis are still in occupation of Gaza, that they're actually going to try and, build this, Abu Dhabi in Gaza, and try and, settle it with moderate Palestinians.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what you think of the viability of something like that. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't think it's going to work. I think that's what some Israeli security managers want to do. I think that's what some developers want to do. There are multiple problems with it. The first is that it would be in a zone under Israeli occupation. And it is a zone that has been largely emptied of population. So there's nobody there. There are a few clans, a few gangs, mainly gangs fostered by, armed by, controlled by the Israelis. But there are not many people there. And anybody who would enter would have to be vetted. And that would mean that a very large proportion of the population wouldn't dare go. They would be going to re-enter an Israeli-occupied zone. So I just don't think it's viable for that and many other reasons. Every time that a colonial authority has tried to create a militia from the subject population, it hasn't really worked. They set it up. They did this with something called the village leagues. The Brits did it with something called the peace something. They tried to recruit Palestinians to help them to hunt down the revolutionaries. Didn't work. South Lebanese army didn't work. So that military part of it, an occupation with local auxiliaries, I don't think that part is going to work. And there's no population in most of those zones that the Israeli military is still occupying, which is well over half of the Gaza Strip. So I just don't see how it could possibly function. I think it's a pipe dream, like much of what is being talked about. I don't think any of it has any possibility of coming into. Maybe over here.
Speaking of the yellow line, do you think that the ceasefire will continue to the other stages and they will move out of the yellow line? Or is this what we're seeing today is what's going to be in the future? I know I'm asking you to assume.
Yeah, I don't know. I obviously don't know the answer to the question. The reports today are that the Israeli army has gotten permission from the government and the Americans to move forward from the yellow line into the areas that they had withdrawn from. In other words, they're expanding the zone under Israeli control. How much, to what extent that's bullshit, I don't know. We'll find out in the coming days. I don't think first of all, the plan is not really a plan. And such as it is, much of it is completely unimplementable. Nobody will go in and blow up tunnels. There is no force on earth that's willing to do that. The United States will not commit troops. You may say whatever you want about the president, he's not going to commit American troops to fighting Hamas. Under no circumstances will he do that. And I don't see any other army that's going to do it. I don't think the Israeli army can do it. If they could have done it, they would have done it. So I don't see that happening. I see some deal where they give up some of their weapons to an Arab force, but that does not mean an Arab force is going to go in with bayonets and fighter jets and force them to do it. But I think the likelihood of even that happening, may or may not happen. But in other words, most of the plan as sketchily laid out is, in my view, largely unimplementable and unrealizable. And the bits of it that are going to have to be modified a great deal. And we may end up, as you suggest, just with Israel in occupation of half of the Gaza Strip and a low-grade war going on the way we have in Lebanon and the way we have in Syria and the way we have in the West Bank. Who knows? Yes, this person here in the front. You.
Sorry, I just forgot what I was going to say. You can come back to me.
Pass it to the next person in the back there.
Thank you so much for your lectures. We all learned a lot. So my question is, how can we sustain this movement? I'm a geographer, so I really think about territory. And reading your book is also a lot about territory. But territories are also not just dictated or changed by people within, but also people, like here, like in this room. So obviously you can learn more, but also what kind of actions we can specifically take Thank you so much. Also, before I forget, I'm Kurdish, so I don't think liberation of Palestine and Kurdistan are separate, or Congo, or Vietnam. It's all interlinked. So I think we should not fall for that, like zero sum. If Palestine is liberated, then we have to, abandon all our causes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I agree with the last thing you said, certainly. These are parts of imperial projects, and they're interlinked imperial projects. I mean, what's being done in Kurdistan, or what's being done in Armenia, or what's being done in Somaliland is linked to Palestine. It's all linked because it's the same actors, and they have the same global view and the same global interest. So yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, look, I'll be blunt with you. I can tell you what I think has happened. That's what a historian does. And I can tell you how I think it affects the present. And I can tell you about movements that have successfully made changes, and I can tell you about movements that have failed to make changes. I can't tell you how to operate in the 21st century in, Trump's America. If I could do that, I would be the head of a political movement, a successful political movement. But I can't do that, obviously. I laid out a few things. It's going to require a lot of hard work and organization. This is not something that simply demonstrating or talking will do. It will require figuring out things that relate to power, political power. And that sometimes means making coalitions with people you would ordinarily never sit with in 100 years. But because the objective requires that, for tactical reasons, you do it. And if you don't do it, you will exist in purity, isolation, and defeat. Those are the two alternatives. I mean, practical politics and political power require those kinds of, and those are hard things to do. It doesn't require people who are pure or people, I know many people who shouldn't and must not enter politics because they're too pure. That's a good thing. Politics is a dirty business. But you need to have a willingness to grasp power and a willingness to do the things that are necessary. That's all I can tell you. I mean, beyond that, But you can read Lenin for that. And maybe somebody over here, the person over here, on the right. No, in the back, in the little back, yeah. Yes. Sorry, it's a long ways over there. No, that one. You had your hand up, gentleman with the glasses.
Thanks, Professor. This is a little inside baseball, but I think it's important though, about a week after October 7th, 2 student workers who sit in Earl Hall at Columbia, one they both put stickers on their laptop, and one said, "By any means necessary, resist colonial oppression." The dean of religious life also sits in that building and went apoplectic, and he has a very close relationship with the Craft Center. And I just wonder, in light of the decision that you just read, if you think there's any opportunity at some point for litigation around First Amendment, or I know Columbia is private, but it seems like a complete violation of free speech.
Yeah. I can't tell you. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and you really, really, really wouldn't want to rely on my advice in legal matters. I think they haven't got a leg to stand on, myself. And I think that the opinion that was rendered in the AAUP case, which is just summed up in an article in Jacobin, if you're interested, by Laurie Allen, and the First Circuit opinion are the basis for a really good challenge to Columbia. But it would require a lawyer to say whether I'm right or not, and I'm just not a lawyer. That's an egregious case of speech suppression. But as you say, Columbia is a private institution. And what was the plaintiffs here were plaintiffs against MIT, claiming that MIT should have done more to suppress speech. Here's a case where the university suppressed speech. You'd have to have a legal angle to get in there. I can't really answer your question. I'm sorry. It's a horrible issue. Right here in front, please. Her. Sorry.
Thank you.
I saw her first.
So my question is actually UN related. So I'm an international lawyer. I get asked this a lot, and quite frankly, I don't know the answer to this question. I get asked why, especially when Israel is always complaining that the UN is, targeting them unfairly. The UN's anti-Semitic. The International Court of Justice renders anti-Semitic opinions.
Yeah.
Why do they continue to participate in the UN at all? Is it simply just for image? I'm not totally convinced by that if the United States is their patron, has not participated in many respects in this international regime, and will continue to fund them anyways.
So your question is, why do they participate?
Why do they participate?
If the
Yeah.
UN is so bad?
Yeah, why do they continue participating at all? What's the point? What do they get out of
Yeah.
it? Is it simply just image? I'm not sure I'm convinced by that.
Yeah. I think it's a podium to speak to their supporters in this country, because people pay attention here, especially the very narrow and shrinking base of support that Israel enjoys in the United States. And it's a podium to speak to, but for Israeli politicians, to speak to their own base in Israel. If you see the way in which Netanyahu's little dog and pony shows before the General Assembly every year are reported in the Israeli press, you can see that he's speaking mainly to his base at home, and secondly to his base in the United States. They don't care about the United Nations per se. They know that a veto protects them in the Security Council and that there's no other agency of the United Nations that has any power over them. And if the Security Council were to take resolute actions, they would be forced to do things. But barring that, they don't need the UN. And so it's a bully pulpit for these two very narrow specific audiences. That's the way I read it anyway. I mean, look at the silly graphics he does. He's obviously speaking to, your average Likud voter in, I don't know, Mea Shearim or some, suburb. That's my guess. You.
I have a quick question. What has stopped Israel or the Israeli occupation army from committing the same genocide in the West Bank in the same manner? I feel like this could have been their opportunity. I know they've dropped bombs on Mukhayam Nur Shams and Tulkarem, and
They dropped bombs yesterday near Jenin.
I know, and Jenin, I was about to say Jenin as well, but they haven't done the same type of leveling in Ramallah, Nablus, rest of the major cities.
I think the main reason is too many eyes on them. Too many people can see, they have completely prevented international journalists from getting into Gaza. So they can pretend that the reality that they fabricate is reality. The West Bank is overrun with hundreds of journalists and thousands of foreigners. And so anything they do is liable to be reported. Now, it's interesting. The level of terror that settlers and the army are waging against Palestinians in the West Bank is very high. It's infinitely higher than it was before. They're burning many more fields, burning many more cars, killing many more civilians, destroying many more homes than they ever did at any time in the entire occupation. But, as you said, it's not rising to anywhere near the level of Gaza, anywhere near, with the exception, as you said, of several refugee camps that they've flattened, or largely flattened, and emptied. So they've done in Jenin camp, in a half dozen camps, maybe 4 or 5 camps in the West Bank, exactly what they've done in the entirety of Gaza. But those are just 4 or 5 spots in the West Bank. And so I think that if they were to ratchet that up a lot further, it would be so visible, and the lying that they do to cover what they're doing would be so apparent that it would really harm their base even more. I mean, they're losing people now who used to support them. In the past, the trickle of movement away from Israel and towards support of Palestinians was mainly of people who were undecided, in the middle, didn't know, tended towards. What's happening now is they're losing people who were fervent supporters of theirs within the Jewish community, within the evangelical community, within the MAGA base, among Republicans, among independents. People who were pro-Israel are moving away because they've seen what they've seen. And I think that would really be accelerated if they did more in the West Bank. It's to my way of thinking, appalling that there hasn't been more of a reaction. The Trump administration has not said one word about the West Bank. One word, except you can't annex it. Except that. But anything else, they haven't said a word about, or they've supported. So I think that it's the visibility of what of the things that you're talking about they're possibly doing on a level of Gaza that they're afraid of. Yeah, have you remembered your question?
Sorry, yeah. I just social anxiety. Are you aware of any systems or any institutions that would actually hold these people to some sort of an international account? Like, can we actually have hope for The Hague?
In some European countries, they actually are bringing suit against individuals. So in Germany, there's a soldier who's being brought to trial, an Israeli soldier, a person who served in the Israeli army. And in other places, the governments have said that this or that Israeli government official would be arrested if they landed or not allowed to land. We're not there here. I mean, Zohar Namdani said he would have the police arrest Netanyahu. I don't know if he'd be able to do that. But it certainly is the case in a lot of European jurisdictions that people are so wound up about this that they have actually prevailed upon political and judicial authorities. And so it's parts of Europe, or increasing parts of Europe, are becoming a no-go zone. Certainly for Israeli politicians and generals and leaders, and sometimes just for individual Israelis who've served in the army, which is to say almost every adult male Israeli. Yeah. Now you.
Okay. Sorry about that. So, Professor, first of all, thank you for this amazing series of lectures that you've given us regarding the issue of Palestine. The things you were talking about, Ari, the change in public opinion is actually very personal to me. I had a chance to read your book this past summer, 100 Years War in Palestine, actually after someone dug up something that I wrote on Twitter that was closer to the media and government opinion on Israel. I apologize for having written that for obvious reasons. And
I never read it. So.
And no, it's fine. But one of the things that stuck with me from your book is that passage on the Dahiya doctrine.
Yeah.
Something that if any other civilized country did, we would call them a pariah state.
Right.
The first time I ever heard of the Dahiya doctrine was in your book, which is, to me, an appalling failure of the news media that they're ignoring this.
Yeah.
So why do you think it is that if you read the New York Times, you read Reuters, you read AP, Israel has the right to defend itself.
Right.
If you read organizations like Mondoweiss, it's Palestine. Doesn't the mainstream media know that all these other organizations are reporting what's actually going on in Palestine despite whatever spin they try to put on it?
Do they know? Well, two things. First of all, a lot of these people who work for these media organizations really don't want to lose their jobs. And, they're working for big media organizations, and they have mortgages, and, and they're probably well paid if they work for the networks or the Times or the Washington Post. And their bosses have a line, and they will traduce or cross that line at their peril. So, I talked to someone who worked for the New York Times, and she said that at meetings, people would say, for example, when someone would bring up the issue of context, you have to put some context to what happened on October 7th. One of the senior reporters at the New York Times said, if you did that, that would offend our Jewish colleagues. You can't do that. Okay? And in saying that, he was reflecting the ethos of the people who own and manage and are executives and senior editors at the New York Times. So that's the first thing. They don't know and they don't believe. They have another set of beliefs. They live in another belief system. The second thing is they are slavish stenographers for power. The Leahy Law and other U.S. legislation mandates that U.S. weapons cannot be used in cases where there are massive violations of international humanitarian law, okay? And where they're not used in self-defense. So every miserable official has to say, Israel acts in self-defense, or they're liable themselves for violating U.S. law. The self-defense thing is a necessary legal protection for what is in fact illegal delivery of weapons to Israel in violation of U.S. law, the Leahy Law and the 1996 Arms Export Act. So you can either oppose power and say, the government is lying through its teeth. There's nothing self-defensive about 82,000-pound bombs being dropped in the Dahi to kill Sayyid Hussein Nasrallah and 100 other people. That's not self-defense. Therefore, you, the Secretary of Defense, you, the President, you, the National Security, are in violation of U.S. law. Or you can go along with their lies and say Israel is acting in self-defense, which is, look at them. They are slavishly obedient to American foreign policy, the mainstream media. And when they differ, it's solely on partisan political lines, Republican versus Democrat. It's not opposing central tenets of American policy, which is any vicious regime which does any violence to its population will be supported if it supports the United States' foreign policy ambitions. So you'll give weapons to Egypt, you'll give weapons to Israel, you'll give weapons to the Emirates, you'll give weapons to any country that you're allied with, and whatever they do with them in Yemen or anywhere else is fine with us. It's self-defense. So that's the reason. I see somebody way in the back with glasses. Yes, you.
Thank you, Professor. A question about political change
Yes.
that you mentioned is one of the hardest things to bring about. How much faith do you have in electoral politics actually bringing about this change? And even though we've seen public opinion shift, we saw what happened with the Democratic Party last year and the DNC and whatnot, and we are seeing maybe some changes with the mayoral election, but it still seems like the broad majority of electoral politics is still in Israel's favor. And how do we bring about that change in a meaningful way that's sustainable long term?
Yeah. I mean, you have to work at different levels. I don't think you ignore the electoral, but you have to work at the popular. You have to work in terms of all kinds of other means. And that is not just the job of people in this country. That's the job of anybody who supports this Palestinian liberation, and primarily the job of the Palestinians themselves, which as excuse me, which as civil society they're trying to do, but which as a national movement they're failing to do right now. They're divided, they're weak, they're leaderless, they're strategyless, they're aimless, they're rudderless, and they're not putting forward a clear strategic path. When you see movements that were successful, whether they mainly adopted nonviolence, as in India, or whether they adopted a range of approaches, as in, say, Ireland, they at least had a strong national movement and a clear strategic aim, even if there were sometimes differences, as in India or as in Ireland after independence. And they used a variety of means. People say to me, well, the Irish liberated themselves by force. Well, yes, they did use force. That's certainly true. The Irish War of Independence was a war in which they fought the British Army and British police, the Royal Irish Constabulary. But they also took elected members of the British Parliament, moved them to Ireland, in Dublin, and formed the Dáil, the representative assembly of the Irish people. And they said, these are elected representatives, and we are the democratic representatives, and we reclaim our independence. And that was a fantastically important element in the legitimacy of what the Irish were doing, at the same time as they were ambushing British convoys and assassinating British intelligence agents. They didn't just carry out an armed struggle and, yay, that'll do it. No. They also spent a huge amount of energy in this country and in Britain organizing and proselytizing and campaigning and raising money. The entire armed struggle in Ireland was financed from here. De Valera spent the entire War of Independence in the United States raising money and organizing political support. The entire War of Independence. He went back home when the war was over. And that was another element, the diplomatic and the financial and so on. And that was the case during the Troubles. Sinn Féin was financed from here. Gun runners were sending stuff from here, Armalites and so on and so forth, from the United States. On 124th Street, there's a police precinct, and there's a wall. There used to be a wall of a building abutting the parking lot of the police station, on which were Bobby Sands and the martyrs who starved themselves to death in Longkesh. Okay? The police put that up. Those guys supported the Sinn Féin. And that was the result of decades and decades and decades and decades and decades and decades of organization. Now, I'm not going to compare the Zionist movement to a liberation movement, but the same is true of the Zionist movement. They spent ages in this country organizing and raising money and so on and so forth. Ben Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, the second president of the State of Israel and the first prime minister, spent the entire World War I period in the United States organizing and raising money. World War I. And Ben Gurion came here almost every third or fourth year. And Weizmann was here almost every year, from the World War I through the 40s. Well, that's how you liberate yourself. I'm not talking about Zionism, but I'm saying you have to have a multiplicity of methods. Now, that's for the Palestinians. What we do here as support for that is something else. It has to, to be successful, to some extent, it has to be linked to a coherent, strategically led Palestinian national liberation movement, which once upon a time we had and which we do not have today. But to some extent, it has to be independent, and it has to be linked to, for example, Palestinian civil society, so the BDS movement and so on and so forth. Now, electoral politics is part of it, I think. And I think I'm a little surprised at the impact it's already had. The degree to which the base of the Democratic Party is at war with the pro-Israel Zionist leadership of the party is an indication of the fact that actually this is having an effect even on electoral politics. The members of the House of Representatives who are publicly announcing they will not accept support from AIPAC. I don't know how old any of you are, but 10, 12, 15 years ago, could you have believed that a member of Congress would have publicly said, I refuse to accept money from AIPAC? Inconceivable. Now, I don't think that means, the political reality of either of these two political giants, mega mastodons, is going to change. But it's an indication of the impact of pressure from below. Whether you actually believe that that's how you're going to end up achieving change, or whether that's one of the methods that's going to help to achieve change, that's another question. And that's a question for strategists and tacticians, not for a historian. You. Yes, one more question. You're the last questioner.
Awesome, amazing. I feel very honored. Thank you very much for another fascinating lecture. They've all been fantastic. We've all learned so much from them.
Thank you.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, alongside the genocide in Gaza, Israel's other wars in the region, the wars in Lebanon, the bombing of Yemen, the bombing of Syria. And I wanted to add a little thing to that, which is that while public opinion in the United States and around the world has shifted very, very strongly against Israel, public opinion within Israel has become extremely right-wing, extremely, even more xenophobic than it has been over the previous decades. And I wonder what that means for engagement on a political, diplomatic, military level with Israel going forward.
Those are two questions, actually. Those are the last two questions. Let me start with the second, and then I'll go to the wars in the region. Israeli public opinion has shifted, as you say, over many years, in fact, very, very significantly to the right. It's much more influenced by Jewish supremacist notions. It's much more influenced by the Greater Land of Israel ideology. And that's not new. That's long before this war that shifted has taken place. And that was encouraged and mirrored by the complacence and complicity of the support that Israel gets from this country in particular. Not the slightest slap on the wrist for anything that the settlement project was doing in the West Bank. Not one. You sanctioned 2 settlers? Really? Seriously? These people are burning olive groves. They're killing people. And you don't let them come into the United States and you freeze their accounts? That's not even a slap. It's not even a tap on the wrist. So they sincerely and rightly believed they could literally do anything. And so the movement to the right has just been unchecked. Now, I think the interesting question is going to be whether the kinds of changes in Israeli public opinion that we saw, say, in the 50s when Eisenhower stopped them, or say after the October War when Kissinger forced them to do certain things, or there are several times when Israeli public opinion actually has shifted in a different direction as a result of a change in the metropole, as a result of a change in American policy or American public opinion. The question, therefore, is the incredible pressure, especially in Europe, on individual Israelis, on Israeli academics, on Israeli business, on Israeli imports and exports, on the Eurovision Song Contest, on FIFA, that constant barrage of you are pariahs, what you are doing is unacceptable, will that affect Israeli public opinion? So far, it actually hasn't, apparently. There are more and more people in Israel saying, oh my God, this is terrible, but they're still a minority. And I think we have to wait and see whether that pressure from the outside will force Israelis to realize that they are absolutely dependent on the outside and they cannot continue in this course. I don't know if that's going to happen. I mean, I have a friend who went there, and he's a distinguished historian of this, of actually the Roman period in Palestine. And he said these people are not just genocidal, talking about the leadership and the political trend, they're suicidal. What they are doing is going to destroy their project. And he's not a person I would, he said this reminds me of the Zealots. This reminds me of Bar Kokhba. This reminds me of the people who provoked the Romans to destroy the Second Temple. He knows what he's talking about. So they may not wake up in their majority. I don't know. My sense in the past is that that kind of external pressure has ultimately had an impact on Israeli, even electoral politics and public opinion. It may not this time. I don't know. I can't predict. Your broader question. What we are seeing in Lebanon and Syria and Yemen, which is direct Israeli military intervention, constant. I mean, they're attacking Lebanon almost every single day. There's an attack in South Lebanon almost every single day. Almost every day they kill somebody. Almost every single day. They still occupy 5 large areas in South Lebanon. They're not bombing Syria as frequently as they did, but they still occupy a vast swath of southwestern Syria. And they've been bombing Yemen, as you say. This is actually nothing new. Tunisia, Sudan, Egypt, Yemen, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and now Qatar. These are all countries that have been bombed by Israel. Okay? Almost half of the countries in the Middle East have been attacked by Israel at some time in the last 40 or 50 or whatever it is years. So this is the way they roll. Force and more force. And if force doesn't work, then more force. That's the way they deal with their environment. That's what settler-colonial projects do. You have to keep going forward or you're pushed backwards. And you have to there's a thing called colonial fear, settler fear, which drives this. We are a villa in the jungle, Barak said, which means you have to be constantly pushing the jungle back by force. If they're not weaned of this, I don't think anybody can be particularly optimistic for this project in the long run, because I don't see how they can sustain this over time. I honestly don't. On the other hand, for the immediate future, who's going to stop them from bombing anything? The Americans probably will stop them from bombing some Gulf countries because too many American interests are. They clearly crossed a red line there. But with that minor exception, they can keep doing it. I mean, I have not seen one American action to stop what they're doing in Lebanon. On the contrary, it is clear that they have approval. I don't see one American action to stop what they're doing in Syria or Yemen or the West Bank, or for that matter, in Gaza. I mean, the Israeli media today said the bombings today in Gaza were approved by the Americans. Now, that may not be true. We'll find out, but probably it's true. So this is their modus operandi in dealing with the region, beating down people until they get them to submit to whatever conditions. They're trying to get a specific set of arrangements in Lebanon, a specific set of arrangements in Syria, and they're using the main tool they're using is force and coercion. And that's how they roll. That's the way they operate. Not new at all. Ladies and gentlemen, and those of you who are neither, thank you very much. You like that?
Let's keep it going. Another round of applause. I agree. I 100% agree. That was amazing. Professor Khalidi, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I have many more words to say, but this was an incredible course. an incredible 5-part course that was attended by thousands of people across the world, hundreds of people in New York City. And you know that we can't end a course like this without a clear call to action. We've gotten many throughout this course, and I want to continue as we close out this course for other ways to stay plugged in if you're in New York, if you're across the country, and if you're across the world. So I'd like to welcome Jamil from the Palestinian Youth Movement to share some knowledge.
Thank you, Saidi, and thank you, Professor Rashid Khalidi, for that amazing and enriching short course on Palestine. My name is Jamil. I'm with the Palestinian Youth Movement. And as we know, there is still a genocide, but now under the guise of a ceasefire. And in the words of Professor Khalidi, this ceasefire allows the siege to continue. And ceasefire or not, we know the struggle is not over. We know the struggle does not stop until total liberation. And if you want to take up that struggle in your locale in Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, Staten Island, the Bronx, then you need to be here organizing with your friends, family, neighbors every Monday at 6:30 right here at the People's Forum. So that's the first thing. And we also heard a common theme of today's lecture was about the importance of building political power in your movement for liberation. So the main campaign that we've been taking up in our meetings lately and for the foreseeable future is the AIPAC Out of US Politics campaign. Yeah. The people have awoken to AIPAC's influence. There has been, in the words of, again, Professor Rashid Khalidi, there has been a dramatic shift in popular consciousness, and it is on us to sustain that shift. Billions of dollars are sent by AIPAC-funded politicians here to commit genocide in Gaza, while many people here lose health care, and next month millions more are about to lose SNAP benefits. These are the same politicians who time and time again are voting against progressive politics that could benefit their constituents, but instead are using it to commit a genocide abroad. And now is the time to capture everyone's animosity towards AIPAC and use it so that support for Israel of any form becomes untenable, and so that AIPAC can no longer carry out its genocidal policies in Palestine and oppress people here in the imperial core. So if you want to be a part of the fight against AIPAC, be a part of the fight in the struggle for liberation, and to remove Israel's influence on US politics, talk to us in the back, sign our petition, and most importantly, be here to actually organize towards this on the streets. Thank you.
Amazing. So I look forward to seeing everybody here again on Mondays. Every Monday we have a volunteer meeting where we begin with a political orientation, and then we break out into neighborhood, borough groups, and then neighborhood groups, and plan local actions to continue to bring more people into the struggle. Before we close out the course, I want to extend a big warm thank you to everyone who's come to the People's Forum for the past Tuesday for the first time. Many people for the first time, many people who have come here before. Actually, I did this on the first day, but I'd like to ask again. Is this anyone's first time here at TPF for this course? Okay, that's a pretty big number. For people this is their first time or multiple times, thank you for coming. Thank you for keeping the space alive. This is a place that we continue to build together. It's a place in which our solidarity with Palestine, with Cuba, with Venezuela, with all people who are in the fight against US imperialism is at the front of our work. It's not something on the side. It's not something we shy away from. It's at the very heart and center of our work here. And you know, that's very rare to find in places like in New York City and places in the United States. So I invite you to come back to keep this place going. Actually, next Tuesday, we start a course on the radical history of the labor movement. And we know that the organization of workers, the mass movement of the organized workers is actually what pushes history forward. Every single thing that we've had in this country, every progressive, every feature of progress we've had has been through the mass organization of workers. So in this course, we'll study the radical history of the labor movement, the attacks on labor, and basically how we could understand the state of the labor movement today. So if we have there it is. Let Them Tremble, Power, Crisis, and Opportunities in the Labor Movement. So I invite you to sign up for that course as well. as well as to continue to support the People's Forum. If you know, I don't know if you know, but we're actually fundraising to build a permanent home for the people that will continue to host courses like these. And it's been a major task that we've taken on to renovate a building that is, pretty much from scratch, to build a place like this so we can continue to have programming like this. So I encourage you, if you can today, help us fundraise to meet this building. This literally will not happen unless we're able to do it together. So if you're able to donate, if you're able to send it to a friend, if you're able to organize, I don't know, a fundraising party, something. If you're good at grant writing, find any one of us here, and thank you for your support. Let's help to build a permanent home for the people. That's literally me. Thank you, everybody. If you have any issues, once again, with the student portal, any recordings, readings, please find any one of us. You'll have indefinite access to the material, so please let us know. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. We want to play a song for you guys. Sure. Yes? All right. Please welcome them. Go ahead. Do you have any, do you happen to have a stand? It's okay. Shukran. This is a song from Syria and the larger Arab world called Allah محيي شوارعك يا بلادنا المعمورة. Ready? لو 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 لا لي لو 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 لا لي الله محيي شوارعك يا بلادنا المعمورة لو 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 لا لي لو 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 لا لي الله محيي شوارعك يا بلادنا المعمورة الله محيي شوارعك يا بلادنا المعمورة يا صوتي علي واركب جناح الهوى خلي خبر سلم لنا على أهلنا يا دولتي اللي ما ينفع فيها دوا إلا الحبايب والسهر بديارنا لو 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 لا لي لو 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 لا لي الله محيي شوارعك يا بلادنا المعمورة لو 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 لا لي لو 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 لا لي الله محيي شوارعك يا بلادنا المعمورة الله محيي شوارعك يا بلادنا المعمورة يا ريتني علق عتبتك يا دارنا واليوم ما أحلى النوم فوق ديارنا يا ميمتي والحضن كان مخدتي يا ربي تجمع بالحبايب شملنا لو 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 لا لي لو 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 لا لي الله محيي شوارعك يا بلادنا المعمورة لو 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 لا لي لو 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 لا لي الله محيي شوارعك يا بلادنا المعمورة الله محيي شوارعك يا بلادنا المعمورة يلا برافو وشكرا.
Give it up for Brooklyn Nomads. Thank you, everybody.